Section 7, the high-fat approach. This is something that a lot of athletes and clients and maybe health professionals haven't heard of before, but it's becoming more popular. And I wanted to throw this in here as part of this course. Can you perform on a low-carb, high-fat diet? The answer that we're seeing more and more is yes, you can. I wasn't a believer myself until recently. I've got a couple of books here. I started reading a book by the name of Good Calories, Bad Calories, with the author of named Gary Taubes, and it really talked about how Gary Taubes is a science journalist, and he picks out these controversial topics and really digs into them, and really got into the history of how we came about the recommendations of eating a low-fat diet, and he really kind of blew some of that stuff out of the water. If you're interested in this topic, this is his big, thick, this book. I don't know how many pages it is, but it's really big. If you're interested in this topic, he's got a sort of a Cliff's Note version of this called Why We Get Fat. That might be the one I recommend. That might be the one I recommend for you. But I wanted to try this myself because you heard all of this about how, eating a high-fat diet will cause heart disease and this type of thing, and increase your cholesterol levels. So I had to try it myself. So my wife and I went on a 6-week high-fat diet where we were eating 60 to 70% of our calories from fat. And the most important aspect of this is we went to the lab to get our blood work done before we started this and then after we finished. Well, let's just talk about what happened as I went through. So as I was eating this high-fat diet, over the first week, as you might expect, I lost a lot of weight. I did because I was cutting the carbohydrates down, and I lost a lot of weight. And 1,500 calories, because I was tracking my stuff, tracking what I was doing, 1,500 calories was really filling me up. But what happened over time is I started to eat more calories, and I started to eat more calories. And eventually, at the end of the 6 weeks, I was gaining weight on this approach. Now, this approach really isn't for me because I was eating, pretty much any type of fat worked for me. Everything from, healthier types of fats that you find in avocados to coconut oil to you name it. I was bacon, any kind of fat worked, right? And that's something that, I just couldn't sustain over time. But interestingly, when we went to get our blood work done, is, I never really had glucose problems before. My sugar was always really good. And guess what? It was even lower after going on this high-fat diet. And then my triglyceride levels, you would think that, oh gosh, eating this high-fat diet, they would go up. But actually, the bottom fell out. My triglyceride levels really, really dropped. My total cholesterol maybe went up a little bit, my total, but it's because my HDLs just shot through the roof. My LDLs increased a little bit, but my HDLs were just incredibly, off the charts. So the point is that my blood work actually was better than what it was before. So that really kind of opened my eyes, and I started getting into looking at this, lower carbohydrate fueling strategy where you're really focusing on fat. And what they call that is the keto-adapted athlete. And there are definitely different versions because for the last 30 years I had learned in every nutrition textbook, you got to have at least 130 grams of carbohydrate, to stay out of ketosis. And ketosis is just a condition where your body is using fat, these ketone bodies for fuel instead of glucose. And it does take a while for that to happen and for you to shift that way. But just to give you that's when I bought the book by Volek and Finney, Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, and started looking into higher fat athletes, athletes that are eating higher fat. And Timothy Olson in 2012 won the Western States 100, which is the original 100-mile run. And he's a high-fat athlete, a fat-adapted athlete. And here's a guy, his name's Zach Bitter. In 2013, he set the American record by running 100 miles in under 12 hours. If you calculate that, that's like a 7-minute, 4-second per mile pace for 100 miles. really unbelievable. And he was a high-fat athlete. Now, it doesn't mean to say that if he wasn't eating high carbs that he wouldn't be a really good athlete either. My idea here, I'm not here to say one way is better than another. My idea is that there may just be more than one way to do it. And all these years, we really kind of focused on carbohydrate fueling, but there may be other ways to go about it. So there's articles really that are really starting to come out now looking at, rethinking fat as fuel. By now, there should be, Volek, I think, has completed the first study. He called it the FASTER study, where he had subjects that these were endurance athletes that either had were high carb athletes or high fat athletes, and he was comparing them, and it should be interesting to see the results. And it has gotten a lot of publicity. Should athletes, a lot of controversy out there. Should they eat high fat or high carb? I just think that there's more than one way to do it. And I took this from Zach Bitter's blog, and I hope he won't mind, but basically this just shows you some of the foods that he was consuming and consumes during his training. And it's not like he's not eating any carbohydrates. He's eating, there's a sweet potato in there, but typically, and that's what I found, is I would be eating, when I was eating the 60-70% of my calories from fat, I was eating a lot of foods that really didn't go together in my mind. And I wasn't, So this is what you see here with Zach Bitter's diet, where he's eating salmon for breakfast, and he's got a carrot and some spinach and some cheese. It's just stuff that you don't really see put together. Lunch, he's eating 2 ounces of sausage and some cheese with the pre-workout with half a cup, right? Half a cup of raw almonds, that's a lot of calories. But this guy's an endurance athlete who's running, 10, 15, 20 miles a day probably. Training a lot. Here's dinner where he's eating calf liver and bacon and cabbage and sour cream. Again, it's just stuff that doesn't necessarily go together. So I'm just here to say that there's another way to go about it, especially when you look at endurance athletes, and more research is actually starting to come out in strength and power athletes on looking at the high-fat approach. And, there's a fellow by the name of Sibahar that I mentioned previously. He has this strategy that he calls metabolic efficiency, where you teach your body to use more fat. And eating a lower carb approach teaches your body to do that. Sibahar is more of a, when we talk about metabolic efficiency, he's not really necessarily a low carb guy, but he's just into making sure that you maintain glucose levels, sustain glucose levels throughout the day, and you don't get that fluctuation. And part of that is just controlling your carbohydrates. And Volek in the National Strength Conditioning Association conference a couple of years ago put it this way: an endurance athlete hitting the wall is like a gas tanker running out of gas on the highway. So you got this gas tanker who's carrying all this gas in the back, yet it's sitting on the side of the road because it's running out of gas. And that's, when you think about endurance athletes, you've got all these calories stored as fat. Like we said, you got 70,000 calories stored as fat, yet you're bonking and hitting the wall. Why is that? So when you look at this fat-adapted approach or this metabolic efficiency approach, it usually takes a couple of weeks to really adapt to that. And if you're interested, and I'm not going to belabor this, but there are several people that are kind of leaders in this area, guys like Jeff Volek and Ben Greenfield and Bob Sibahar and Tim Noakes, which I haven't really mentioned Noakes, but Noakes is this guy who wrote years ago this huge book called Lore of Running, and he was the guru of this, the running craze, if you will. He's a sports scientist from South Africa, and he was preaching really this carbohydrate, high carbohydrate diet. Well, now in his later years, he ended up getting type 2 diabetes. So now he has switched, and he's really promoting this higher fat approach. And the fact that, the 130 grams that they recommend for some people just doesn't work. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that for some people, this might be the best approach. And he's basically, the idea is that some people can tolerate different levels of carbohydrate. For some people like me, I can tolerate higher levels, at least for now. But some people just can't do that, and they're resistant to that, and that causes them to gain weight. Here's a study just showing you pretty recent studies showing you that this ketogenic or this low carbohydrate diet doesn't affect strength performance in gymnasts. And I think you're going to see more and more research coming out in the strength and power arena looking at, higher fat approaches, and the fact that there's probably not going to be any performance decrement for athletes as long as you're taking in an adequate amount, and that's going to vary based on the individual and the activity that they're performing. Just to give an example of what this might look like, another example is a high-carb diet. Here where you're doing your typical bowl of cereal with a banana and some milk. That's 500 calories, but that's 75% carbohydrate. Versus your, 2 fried eggs and some bacon with some toast, that's still 500 calories, but it's about 60% of calories coming from fat. So the point here is there's just a number of different ways to do it. You've got to figure out what's going to work for you. I just wanted to throw that out there and talk to you about my experiences that, this worked for me. It did work, and my blood work improved, but it's just something that I couldn't necessarily sustain. But if you're working with your athletes, if they bring this to you, be open to working with them on that. And don't shut them down and think, there's only one way to do it, because research is kind of showing that maybe there is more than one way, and this high-fat approach can definitely work for some athletes. So that wraps up Module 6. I look forward to seeing you in Module 7.